Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back with another live episode of Everything Compliance. Today we have the quartet of Matt Kelly, Karen Woody, Karen Moore, and Jonathan Armstrong. So, ladies and gentlemen, we will start with Mr. Armstrong. What do you have for us today, Mr. Armstrong?
Thanks very much, Tom. I have been looking at the brand new SFO guidance, and it's fair to say that it's been a good week, I think, for the Serious Fraud Office. Which might be a first, they seem to live stream a dawn raid. I'm not sure many regulators do that this week, where they raided 5 properties in connection with allegations of bribery in connection with a Microsoft data center in the Netherlands, where they seemingly coordinated dawn raids in 5 locations across the EU and Monaco, and presumably to the director's TikTok channel, although I wasn't on it at the time. And that involved some 70 staff. We're not sure how many of them were the TikTokers or streamers and how many were the officials, but they certainly stepped up enforcement in terms of dawn raid. And we also saw a successful conviction for bribery offences, not under the SFO's jurisdiction this time, but under Devon and Cornwall police, who secured convictions over the building of a new residential village, if you like, called Cranbrook, where there were issues over the power system. And there have been some sentences there of around the 4-year mark for bribery. But the SFO has decided to try and refresh the relationship with corporates and look again at guidance on self-reporting. Now, those astute listeners will recall that we had previous guidance on self-reporting that was withdrawn by the last director, but one, David Green, who wanted to have, if you like, less opportunities for corporates to do deals. We then had the Lisa Azovsky regime, which we've talked about before on this podcast. Probably best we talk about it less rather than more. And then we've got a new director, as I say, who seems to be into old-fashioned coppering, doing dawn raids, and doing deals where possible. And the new guidance tries to give organizations more certainty about the likelihood of them being dealt with appropriately if they self-report matters to the SFO. Unlike in your part of the world, bribery is still a crime. It's still being investigated. It's still being prosecuted. And the SFO says that if a corporate self-reports promptly to the SFO and cooperates fully, they can expect a DPA, so a deferred prosecution agreement, rather than a prosecution unless circumstances apply. Now, the guidance makes it clear, as the earlier guidance did, that each case turns on its own facts. They will need to be usually some sort of investigation prior to reporting. They'll need to be a pretty early come to government, although when it's less clear-cut, the SFO takes into account the fact that the corporate may need to do more investigation before it can determine whether it's got something to say or not. The key to this is what's called genuine cooperation. It's a term we've heard before from bribery regulators and from antitrust regulators. There's a little bit of clarity on what genuine cooperation is. It's, quote, over and beyond what the law requires. So it could involve promptly handing over digital and hard copy materials for the SFO to sweat them, like it's done in Rolls-Royce and Airbus and other investigations. It could involve procuring and providing translations of foreign language documents. It could include regular catch-ups with running commentary on the investigation, and somewhat controversially, it could include a waiver of privilege over documents, although the SFO says that valid claims of privilege will not be penalised. And it gives a short list of things that aren't cooperative conduct, which includes things like forum shopping, jurisdictions, and attempts at obfuscation. And obviously, those things that aren't cooperative are generally uncooperative. One of the most interesting pieces of the guidance, though, is a little bit like SLAs in a contract. So these aren't binding, but the SFO are saying that if you do the above, then you can expect us to aim to hit standards to give you certainty. And this can be really relevant to a corporate because obviously the fact that they have reported a bribery incident can affect share price. It can mean that the opportunity to do deals goes. And indeed, in some cases, the opportunity to do deals has led to corporates trying to seek a DPA from the SFO. So these SLAs suggest that if a business self-reports, it can expect a call back within 48 hours. They promise that the SFO will regularly update them throughout the process. They'll decide whether or not to open an investigation within 6 months of the initial report. They'll conclude their investigation in what's called a reasonably swift time frame, no months there, and they'll aim to conclude DPA negotiations within 6 months of sending an invitation. Note that's negotiations, not the DPA being concluded, because that still requires a judge's approval in the UK. So the timelines aren't wholly in the control of the SFO for a DPA. All of that seems promising. From my experience, to be really frank, the SFO are normally pretty good at all of those things. I've found them to be quite timely in replying, etc., etc. But I guess it gives corporates more certainty in having these guidelines as to what the timetable might look like. One of the things to say is that, again, some of this, however, might be outside the SFO's control. We've seen big investigations like Airbus and like Rolls-Royce, where they've tried to synchronize investigations in different countries. And I guess the difficulty there is if you've got a slow-moving country, that might slow down the SFO's investigation if they are trying to coordinate. And we also know that foreign cooperation is a key factor of many investigations. As I said in my opening remarks, we've had cooperation with Monaco in the Blue 3 Mace investigation. And so that could also be a factor that takes things outside the SFO's control. However, under the new director, they've certainly moved with more pace. If we look at the Axiom Inc. investigation, for example, into the collapsed law firm formerly known as Ince & Co., we went from initial investigation to charge in 15 months, which for a complex fraud or bribery investigation is pretty quick, really, when all's said and done. As I say, I think there's a new broom at the SFO, as well as those couple of cases I mentioned before. They've got some new charges in the insurance sector in connection with reinsurance activity in Ecuador. They've got a bit of new money. So the government allocated them an additional £9.3 million worth of funds in November. And remember that the SFO is very much in credit in Treasury terms. They have levied far more fines than the money they have spent investigating. So I think certainly under the last director, some people almost predicted the demise of the SFO. I think it's too early to read the funeral rites. We've certainly got somebody who's intent on making it an organization that is revived. I hear that morale's better. They're certainly doing more. For corporates, I think the real message is to take them seriously again. Obviously, in September, we have a new regime with failure to prevent fraud as well. So organizations do have to look at wrongdoing, and it's the usual things: training relevant employees, reacting quickly and appropriately to tip-offs, particularly whistleblower reports. The new director would like to incentivize whistleblowers in the UK in a similar way to the US authorities at least used to. And he reckons that bounties will eventually come from the SFO, although he doesn't have the power to do that yet, but he certainly wants to talk to whistleblowers. So if you're a corporate, try and get them to talk to you rather than talk externally first. You've obviously got to allocate appropriate resources to an investigation. I would say this, wouldn't I? That's likely to include external counsel for privilege reasons, because as I've said, even though privilege is being eroded, it is not dead yet. And you've got to look at top-level commitment to stamping out bad behavior. So senior management have to be committed to that. You have to look for mixed messages, things like remuneration. You have to make sure that your structures are in place to stop people thinking bribery is a good thing. And then I guess if I was to pick 5 things to do, the last probably would be to look at that whole supply chain. We've seen from this week's developments that it's often things like procurement, it's often things like suppliers and contractors that are involved in the bribery ecosystem. So you need to do proper due diligence there, especially when you're engaging agents, particularly when you've got intermediaries, and particularly when you've got procurement personnel who've got a lot of power. As we've said before, it is not better to give than to receive in bribery cases, so you can be prosecuted for receiving bribes as well as for offering or giving them. So perhaps a welcome change, at least more certainty, I think, than we had under prior regimes.
Mr. Kelly, you have a question or comment?
I have 2 quick questions here. First, Jonathan, years ago, you rained on my parade when you told me the truth about dawn raids, that many of them are arranged in advance. So they're fully raids and they don't even happen at dawn. Now that we're live streaming dawn raids, do we know whether this was an actual raid and was the golden sun coming up in the east before the raid actually happened? But more seriously, I was also curious, where do British judges fit into this DPA regime? Because I know in the British legal system, the judges there have a lot more discretion, whereas in the United States, a judge pretty much just rubber stamps whatever DOJ and a company reach for a resolution. So tell me the truth about the Dawn raid, and then what role does the judge play in all of this? Do we yet know?
Yeah, it's been pretty sunny over here for the last week, so it's hard to tell whether it's actual dawn or pretend dawn. There's a really good story from a politician called Derek Hatton, who I should say is under investigation himself. I make no comment on his guilt or innocence, but he said that the mistake prosecutors used to make was conducting dawn raids at 7 a.m. And he said he was a Scouser, so I will attempt the accent. He said, but dawn in my house is at 6. So I think the fact of pre-announced dawn raids has been problematical in the past. Obviously, sometimes prosecutors have had helicopters hovering above the building whilst they do the dawn raid. That's a pretty big hint that you're in trouble. These look fairly authentic. The SFO officials are outside the building. I think they've already got access by the time that they're live streaming. But like the ICO, they've got nice jackets like the US authorities with SFO on the back. I happened to see a dawn raid for other purposes in our village the other day, and they've even got A boards in the street with dawn raid in progress. Please cross to the other side of the street. So I think we've got a bit better at advertising enforcement, but I'm not sure of the timing of it. It's interesting that they had one of the relevant ministers in tow and she was live streaming as well.
What about the judges in this news?
Oh, judges. Sorry, Matt. I think they have quite an active role. I think when DPAs came in, there was lots of consultation with the judiciary, and there's basically a sort of two-stage process where the documents are sent to the judge. The judge is asked if he's sort of minded to approve the DPA. The judge can obviously refuse. He can suggest it should be different, or she can suggest it should be different, and then she makes a final order in open court. And we tend to do these things quite transparently. So you'll find that most of the documentation in previous DPAs has been published. There have been redactions, key names, often, particularly if there's a hope or a possibility of personal criminal convictions for some of those involved. But it tends to be a transparent process, and it seems to be a process where the judiciary are very much engaged, both in a sort of quasi-consultative role and then in the final approval of the DPA.
So, Karen Moore, do you have a question and or comment?
I do. For one, Matt, I can tell you that some dawn raids do happen at dawn. In Kazakhstan, my experience was they not only happen at dawn, but they happen with masked people, not in lovely SFO defined uniforms, but masked, black clad people with machine guns entering your process, grabbing documents, and people were available. Dawn raids could be a lot scarier even than you see, in the UK with its very coordinated and polite incursion. I do have a question just generally, which is to what extent companies are actually prepared for dawn raids anymore these days. It seems to me even companies that have pretty well thought out crisis management programs neglect to have a dawn raid procedure, and especially neglect to train really critical personnel, namely the receptionist in the building, what to do when these people show up. I don't know, Jonathan, if you've had experience with that with your clients.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. I've had good and bad experience. We had a client dawn raided a short while ago in a different country, but we had done dawn raid training in that country, and that went all to plan, thankfully. If I'm being really honest, I'd probably say that's the first one that has gone to plan, where people have executed exactly as they should have done. Obviously, you're right. People, I think, don't train enough. They don't test enough. They don't give people proper procedures. And my sense is, certainly in the bribery arena, because we had a whole period of not having dawn raids, people have lost that muscle memory. So it is a good idea to train. My favorite story, which I'll steal from a colleague if we've got time, Tom, is a former colleague of mine did some dawn raid training. A different law firm had drafted the policies, and they called people like the receptionists. The receptionists were meant to call off a list. They'd been euphemistically called helpers. One of the helpers genuinely believed it was her role to help the prosecutor rather than to record, etc., etc. So thankfully it was a rehearsal. But when met with the prosecutor, she asked, which was in the training, what exactly are you looking for? What is the purpose of your investigation, etc., etc. She then proceeded to give a list of ways in which she could help, including saying, don't look in those filing cabinets. All the dodgy documents are in Steve's car. And then shouted, Steve, we're going to need your car keys. And that is, so I think you've got to rehearse. You've got to have proper procedures. You've got to look at what you call these people, and calling them helpers without good training isn't the right way forward.
So if I could share just another story along those lines, we did actually in one what we thought identified as a vulnerable office in, let's say, Northern Europe, we did a dawn raid conducted by our outside counsel. And in debriefing with the management team on how the experience went, the managing director said the person that was interrogating me was very strict and very difficult, and I kind of liked it.
On that note, Mr. Kelly, you have been taking a pretty good deep dive into the ending of the Glencore deferred prosecution agreement. What could you give us maybe your, if not final assessment, current preliminary assessment?
Yeah, this has been interesting. So for those who may not remember, Glencore was one of the bigger FCPA settlements in the Biden administration. I think it was in the first half of 2022, where they paid $1 billion in fines, had to plead guilty, had two different compliance monitors because they were actually pleading guilty to two different crimes. There were FCPA cases, charges, and then there was a market manipulation scheme because Glencore is a commodities broker. So there are all sorts of risks that they could have. They're one of the largest commodity brokers in the world, and this was an enforcement action led by the US back when we led anti-corruption enforcement, but also Swiss and British and a whole bunch of other countries were all involved in this. And that was late or mid 2022. Fast forward to now, they have recently exited those two monitor ships about 18 months early, I think, because the monitor was not actually appointed until mid 2023. But the new Trump Justice Department no longer really wants to do many monitor ships, so they're letting a lot of companies with them off early. But the other thing that Glencore has done is it has started publishing annual compliance progress reports, post them to their website. Everybody can download them. This is a nifty little small but interesting genre of nonfiction for compliance professionals. I know that other companies have done this. Walmart used to do it for a while, I think in the late 2010s. Exelon and First Energy, who were caught up in a domestic US corruption scheme, they had done this for a while, where they published these reports about here's what we have done in our ethics and compliance program for the last year. This latest report that Glencore published, I think about 3 or 4 weeks ago, is their second report. Their first one was much smaller in scope, but this one is really interesting reading for compliance officers. It is well over 100 pages long. It is this nice, glossy, full color examination of how they structure their program, what they've been doing, how many people work at it. So if you are looking for examples of how other large companies are trying to overhaul their compliance program after a major corruption incident, this is a great place to look, whether it's the reports Glencore has put out now or the earlier ones from Exelon and Walmart back in the day. So I'll give you just some examples of what Glencore had been writing about. So in 2024, they had rehabbed and overhauled their corporate code of conduct, and then talked a lot about how they rolled out that code of conduct. It was based on 6 core values that they spent some time figuring out what they wanted the values to be: safety, integrity, responsibility, openness, simplicity, entrepreneurialism. I really liked all of that because when you think about it, if you are a large commodities firm and you have people all over the world who are trying to trade, simplicity, entrepreneurialism, they kind of line up neatly with the business model that Glencore is in. Safety is also one that they are largely involved in mining. Mining is not necessarily a safe business. So trying to remind all employees, this is something we need to pay attention to. But integrity, responsibility, openness, the kind of values you want to emphasize after you have been hauled out in front of the world with a major corruption and bribery and market manipulation scandal. So you see where those values, like, yeah, that makes sense. That's the things that we would want to emphasize. Then they had how do you roll out this code? They had a giant town hall meeting that was live streamed. And then it was live streamed to every employee, but it was live streamed to several different sites around the world. So it was live streamed from main headquarters to sub headquarters. which had like several hundred people each. But then it was live streamed to everybody else. There was a big Q&A with senior management. So there was a lot there. And that alone, I think, is worth reading up if you're wondering about how to relaunch your code. Another thing that I took a deep look at was risk assessments because, okay, big global compliance program. Cornerstone number 1 is the code. Cornerstone number 2 is a risk assessment. And they talked about how they coordinate all of the risk assessments. There is a central corporate compliance team at headquarters that thinks more about what are our big enterprise-wide risks. And then they work with local compliance teams that are scattered around the world to think, what are those risks like where we do business? And then they have a somewhat standard risk assessment process that the local units carry out. There's always document reviews, there's always interviews, there's always an individual risk assessment and whatnot. But that might look different at a highly corrupt region, such as maybe, I don't know, Indonesia or Southeast Asia versus a more mature market, such as Europe or North America. There's some discretion in how local compliance teams can do the risk assessment, but it has to follow this basic structure that we, the corporate compliance team at headquarters, have laid out. There's a lot of back and forth between the local teams and the central team about, is this risk assessment thorough enough? Is it looking at everything? The local teams have a checklist that basically they should go through to make sure that they've documented all the relevant controls. Their report is uploaded into a centralized system, which neatly lets the central compliance team see worldwide, have all of our local teams done an appropriate risk assessment, and can we suss out any common themes or any common issues that we need to worry about at the global entity level. So there's a lot there. Like Glencore is a big, complicated company, and they do have a lot that they're trying to coordinate. And I've only scratched the surface of what this ethics and compliance report has looked at. I might try and do more later on. For those of you who are looking for examples of how do other big companies do this, what could I take from that to graft onto my own compliance program? There's a lot there to consider in this Glencore report. I guess we could say as a final assessment, like they seem to be doing a lot now. They do document a lot of what they've done. This compliance program is certainly busy. It looks like it is also moving leaps and bounds into being more effective than it was, certainly. Of course, the obvious question is, will Glencore maintain this now that the new Justice Department has let them off the monitorship? Clearly, the DOJ under Trump 2.0 really couldn't care less at this moment about a lot of corporate corruption and taking that seriously. Will Glencore maintain this momentum when the big regulator that started it is no longer part of that conversation? I would hope that they'll still publish these reports in the future. I don't know that they will. I don't know if future reports would be diminished. Like I said before, it is a great fount of information and raw material for inspiration for compliance officers. Take it while you can. And as long as they keep putting this out, that's great. But there's already a lot there that you could use as food for thought for your own program.
Karen Moore, you got a comment for us?
I'm going to defer to Karen Woody, actually.
All right, Ms. Woody.
I just always have a Glencore comment. And nice to see that Glencore is being spoken of in maybe a positive light as a result of this monitor report. But I just think it's one of the most perfect, I mean, not perfect, but it's such an interesting case study for the last 30 years. You have a company founded by Mark Rich that's handed to Dan Gertler, who's personally named in the McKinsey and Paradise Papers. Then, amazingly, you wonder what is going to happen to the CEO after Deepwater Horizon. Where does he land? He's the head of Glencore. Just one of these companies that, like, it almost has made its name on having questionable people at the helm. And if you just look up the Wikipedia page of this company, the section on controversies or scandals is longer than anything else. So it does seem to be always this perfect case study. And it's why I kind of rolled my eyes that the Glencore monitorship is going to end early in the Trump administration. So it seems like, of course it is. And so I I appreciate that you had some positive things and that there's some good lessons to be learned from this report. But it is, I think, always a company that you just say, how do you take almost the wholesale brand image, even down to the work they're doing in these really controversial areas, maybe, and in controversial mining and diamonds and cobalt and contracts with Tesla. It's just, it would not maybe be the top of my list of where to jump in as a chief compliance officer, but kudos to whoever does that.
I think that's very fair. I suppose it's a lot like do as I say, not as I do, because Glencore has done a lot of really untoward stuff. But what they're saying in the report is, okay, that's actually interesting. And for a company that's serious about it, it's good. I don't know that Glencore will continue to be serious about it without the momentum of a strong regulator there. And the Trump administration, DOJ, is not going to be that. One would hope. For what it is, this report provides a lot of interesting food for thought for others that, I'll just say, who also take it seriously. How much longer? Who knows? If you're looking for good examples of what are other companies large companies doing that I could maybe copy myself for my own organization, there is a lot in this report that is useful to think about. Everything else that happened before and brought us to this moment, also very true and not flattering, but we are where we are.
All right. Mr. Armstrong, you have a question or comment?
I do not know, other than I have not been able to find out what time the dawn raids took place.
Well, we've got another half an hour, so maybe research assistant can pull it up. All right, Karen Moore. Does nature abhor a vacuum when it comes to anti-corruption enforcement?
Great question. I have been, obviously, so many of us been looking really carefully at what happens to bribery and corruption programs and corporations in the wake of the February executive order and AG advisory on pausing FCPA enforcement for 180 days with a 180-day extension, so effectively a year, and the redirect to focus on cartels and criminal organizations. Not entirely sure how that really fits foursquare in the FCPA, but it'll be interesting there. There's been quite a bit of conversation about why maintaining bribery and corruption programs is still important, maybe even more important in the wake of that executive order and advisory. A couple of interesting things that people have been talking about. One is whether the SEC, which was not specifically directed to step down their FCPA civil examination, whether they'll follow suit. I would say it's pretty definite that Atkins is going to follow the justice lead. We've already seen last month, I think, high-profile exits at the SEC, most notably the head and the deputy chief of the FCPA unit, which says something there. So I don't think we're going to see kind of another angle for FCPA enforcement coming out of the SEC. Still, I think it's really important. It's been said, and it bears repeating, the law is still in place. The statute of limitations is 5 years plus a 3-year tolling period. And if you look at any case, like use Glencore as an example, it reaches back several years into the wrongdoing. So relaxing now is probably not a good idea in terms of likelihood of enforcement. You also don't know what the pause is going to look like after a year. So the law is still the law. The pause is just a pause. The statute of limitations is long, unless we see a third term, in which case I'm going to take my Austrian passport and leave the country. There will be a new administration, a new view on FCPA. My biggest concerns and the things that I hear most from my clients is a fear that employees and companies will take the pause or the relaxation or the potential lack of enforcement to heart in the wrong way and engage in improper activities, which they believe is now in the best interest of the company, but still violates FCPA and other laws. So really doubling down on that messaging, not just coming from compliance, but coming from executive leadership, I think is more critical than ever. Companies also need to remember that they're going to be subject to third-party risk management due diligence, and that's still going to be focusing on bribery and anti-bribery efforts. Keeping up those programs is important as well. I think there's been some other concerns coming not from federal government, not from the DOJ. There is international anti-bribery enforcement, whether it's due to domestic concerns in a country or FCPA like extraterritorial reach, which we see in a number of countries' anti-bribery statutes. Just last month, we saw the Anti-Corruption Task Force, which was formed by the UK Serious Fraud Office. So they really are stepping up, but together with France's Parquet National Financier, the PNF, and interestingly for Glencore, I think the Office of the Attorney General of Switzerland, which has not been notorious for actively pursuing anti-bribery cases. And Glencore certainly is kind of a big red flag target. It'd be interesting to see if the OAG starts to pay attention, given the task force's mandate to look for opportunities with strategic exchange and developing a working group for cooperation proposals. I think that at least in UK, France, and Switzerland, we might see some stepped up enforcement just on the basis of cooperation and possibly a desire to make a name for themselves in the wake of pause in FCPA enforcement, where the DOJ has very often taken a lot of the credit, at least in the press and the public eye, for pursuing corruption cases. As Jonathan mentioned, the Serious Fraud Office issued this self-disclosure guidance with benefits and pathway to a DPA, which may also, again, shift kind of anti-corruption efforts and enforcement outside of the US. I also just been looking at some alternatives, just thinking of that void, Tom, that you mentioned. There's something that I hadn't really thought about, so I'm not taking full credit for this, but I've seen a couple of people write about, which is kind of almost like a residual federal liability under the Travel Act, which is a federal law. It contains broad provisions regarding the use of interstate commerce to distribute the proceeds of any unlawful activity that could open up federal prosecution of violations of state bribery laws or FCPA type of enforcement activities. That was a new one on me. But the area that really interests me the most and got me the most excited for a short period of time is whether state enforcement of FCPA violations is possible. And that was triggered by the U.S. State Attorney General California declaration. Now, I started looking into this. The ability of a state to enforce anti-bribery laws is partly specifically mentioned in Dodd-Frank, which acknowledges dual enforcement between federal and state agencies. Unfortunately, that's via the Consumer Federal Protections Act. And given what's been going on to really gut the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, I think it's going to be a hard case to make on jurisdictional grounds. Nevertheless, California State Attorney General Bonta earlier this month stepped up with an advisory stating really clearly that California is going to pursue and enforce FCPA violations under California's unfair competition law. He cited a lot of case law that made it clear that California is going to do whether or not the case is predicated on federal enforcement by the DOJ or the SEC. He notes that in addition to civil penalties, they can demand restitution and injunctive reliefs, as well as disgorgement as a remedy for UCL violations. It's going to be interesting to see where that goes. There's been some speculation that New York and Massachusetts are the states most likely to follow California, either making statements or quietly pursuing foreign bribery acts under state law. Both New York and Massachusetts have consumer protection laws, which could be used for state prosecution of FCPA violation. California, New York, Massachusetts are going to have jurisdictional hurdles. In California, claims have to involve injury to California plaintiffs or injury resulting from in-state conduct. Similarly, you need injury in-state established for Massachusetts and New York. Massachusetts and New York also have difficult arguments to make that they can include the FCPA for what they consider per se liability under their respective consumer protection acts. Interestingly, though, and similarly, I don't take credit for this, there have been a few pundits that have speculated whether private right of action may arise. In both Massachusetts and New York, private plaintiffs have standing, whether individuals or businesses, to bring claims. Interestingly, some speculation as to whether third-party enforcement agencies outside the U.S. might be able to bring claims under these local state laws. If successful, they get awarded treble damages and attorney fees. So we might start seeing private actors stepping into the state role to enforce FCPA or FCPA-like violations, provided they can establish that nexus to the state itself. Be interesting to see where things go. I do think that there's a lot of appetite out there to still curb foreign bribery on the part of the U.S. and other organizations, and we'll see where it leads.
Ms. or the professor, do you have a question or comment for Karen?
Yeah, a little bit of both. To your prior point about the risk of there being a lapse or a lag, I guess I should say, in any sort of FCPA compliance, I'd posit that maybe there could be the opposite effect for, just hear me out on this. If I had some inkling that there was potentially an FCPA issue in my company or in my client's company, I would walk myself straight into Todd Blanche or whomever. I assume they've shuttered the FCPA unit and get a declination today because they don't want to touch it, and just make sure you get a promise that there wouldn't be something maybe in the future, given that they say they don't care about it right now. So that might be a reason to keep your foot on the gas in terms of looking around, because if there's ever a more maybe amenable Department of Justice to make sure this goes away, it might be right now. And then my second question, you sort of answered in terms of the state prosecutions, because I have been thinking about this too, and it does seem tricky given that the success of the FCPA really was dependent upon the OECD and sort of the other signatory countries providing essentially these MLATs to work out. But I think you've sort of answered my question on that, in that it is such a different process and that it'll be a state-based claim. There might still be issues with sort of extraterritorial evidence or things that might get trickier if you're just the state of California and maybe not a signatory to some sort of MLAT or something like that. So that was one thought. And then the other thought that just popped up was the Innospec and Newmarket example we saw a couple months ago about Newmarket suing in the aftermath of the Innospec FCPA for essentially unfair competition by realizing they didn't get the contracts because Innospec was the one who won the contracts through bribery. So I wonder if we'll see that also as a collateral attack in the wake of no FCPA. So those were some of my thoughts. I'd be curious if you have comments on those.
Yeah, I just think it's an ingenious and very devious idea, Karen, to go and get a declination, grab a declination now. I suppose the problem there is that you're kind of putting it all out on the table, and declinations can also be, I suppose, revisited. But really interesting idea there to think about where that might go and how you might roll that into your strategy if you've discovered something internally. I do think if you've discovered something internally, you've kind of got this quandary about what to do about self-reporting. They haven't taken any of the self-disclosure in the U.S. off the table at the DOJ. Do you go ahead and do it? Do you just try and hide that now that you're kind of on notice that you violated a federal law? You're just going to sit on that and wait and see what happens? Hope that what effectively is an 8-year statute of limitations is going to run. Yeah, interesting times for the strategists.
Mr. Kelly.
Yeah, I have a couple of comments here. I'll try and run through them. First, to Karen Woody, your point about if you have an issue now, should you go directly to the deputy AG and try and get a declination? On one hand, I see the sense in that because I bet you probably could, and I bet they'd rubber stamp it. On the other hand, I'm almost tempted to say, you're serious. You're actually going to take the Justice Department at its word. Do you need your head examined? Because these people, you can't trust a word they say, even if they believe it today. And then Donald Trump 9 months later just tweets out, you know what, we're going to prosecute your company anyways because I don't like you. What do you do with that? I hate to say it, but I think there really is a strong incentive right now that if you have an issue, the last thing you really want to do is go to this Justice Department, because this department is full of a bunch of, I don't even know what the word is, but you can't trust a single word they say. Mostly because they are at the whim and beck and call of a president who you can't trust what he says. That's it. That's the thing. I am struck by how many compliance conferences these days you see now that there are no Justice Department speakers where there would have been, or they are canceling at the last minute, or there's an empty chair with a placard that says DOJ. And is that disappointing? Somewhat. because it would be nice to hear what they're thinking. On the other hand, is anybody surprised? Because what's the point of listening to the Justice Department right now? The president is going to run roughshod over anything they say anytime he wants, and you have to live with that. Second big thing I would want to say, though, is I am curious whether we will see foreign governments step up their prosecution of the FCPA, because that is going to be a good, effective tactic for a lot of business countries when they're trying to tangle with the United States in the trade war.
Mhm.
The United States runs a deficit on goods with many countries around the world. However, we run a surplus on services, which is something that Donald Trump seems never to think about. And if you are a foreign government trying to exact leverage on a big US interest in your country, the best way to do it probably is going to enforce laws you have against services giants. So you're going to see like the digital services tax and enforcement there against the big tech companies. You could easily see something like an anti-bribery enforcement against not a big manufacturer, but a big services company. So if I was I don't know, a Oracle or McKinsey or some of the others around the world who provide services, and that is a U.S. export, and you can't really put a tariff on a service, but you can screw over the service providing company if you're a foreign government. This is a way to do it. And then my third and last point is I'm trying to figure out, is there a scenario where a U.S. company has enough exposure in a foreign government that your U.S. kickback to Donald Trump, when you donated $1 million to his inauguration fund or something like that, could that constitute a bribe to a foreign government official that the foreign government over there would then be able to bring an action against a U.S. company for its payoff to Donald Trump, which plenty of companies are doing right now, and we all know it. You could easily see who has given money to that inauguration company or committee, and now suddenly all of the enforcement actions against those companies are being canceled. All of the crypto firms where the enforcement against them is vanishing like it's going out of style. And one of the biggest crypto players in the country right now is Donald Trump. So would any of that in US stuff somehow possibly create exposure for anti-corruption enforcement by a foreign government? That's a question I would love somebody to answer for me.
For our listeners to this podcast, we just had a special guest appearance by Conspiracy Matt. With that, Professor Woody, any comments to that?
No, I'll let Karen jump in on anything on that.
Yeah, I thought all of that was so much food for thought, Matt. Not surprisingly, coming from you, that last one is an interesting one. I think there you're looking at that kind of extraterritorial bribery thing. You'd need non-US resident bribing Donald Trump in order to trigger the laws outside of the US for bribery and corruption. So it'd be interesting to see how that works on kind of the idea of some sort of response to sanctions. I think that enforcement, frankly, under data privacy laws for data privacy violations would be even more effective than looking at bribery and corruption, because there it's almost impossible to comply, especially for the service providers. It's really difficult. I don't think anybody's doing it very well personally. I also think that this kind of up in the air data transfer agreement structure that keeps getting shot down and rebuilt provides ample opportunity, at least for Europe under the GDPR, to start making claims against US companies. So I think all of that's going to be really interesting. I think the US, rather than being the leader in setting standards, has now become the target for companies that are enacting and enforcing pretty robust anti-corruption and other legislation.
I was sorry to interrupt. I was going to say the same thoughts were going through my head as Matt's, I think, in some respects. And I think that whilst ever bribery remains on the statute book as a crime in the US, the fact that it isn't enforced still causes problems, because you can get things like poker offenses, money laundering type offenses. If the organization goes to government and says, yeah, we procured a contract in Nigeria and we paid a bribe to procure that contract, if the money goes through banks in Europe, then I think you've potentially got a money laundering issue, because it was still a crime. So I think it isn't, I think it's a really complex equation going to government. I think you're right, Karen, that it seems attractive initially, but I think for most corporations, they're going to have to think through where that leads. And I think, Karen, I think the other thing would be that US nationals can still be prosecuted in other countries. So UK, France, etc., will have provisions in the UK if the act takes place in the UK. So the meeting takes place at Heathrow, for example, that would be enough to give the UK jurisdiction. Were it so minded, it wouldn't matter whether that's a US national or not in those circumstances. So I think it's a really complex set of thoughts any corporation would have to go through before relying on a perhaps temporary blind eye turning administration.
With that, Karen Woody, what do you see in the intersection of tariffs and the False Claims Act?
The segue here is, what then? If no FCPA, what then? And after thinking about that for a while, I think the answer is tariff fraud. And so I see coming down the pike that given the Trump administration priorities and the shift in the Department of Justice priorities, that there could be a ramp up in the near term on criminal liability for tariffs. And again, much like the FCPA prior to 2000, maybe seen as a sleepy, not heavily enforced, or not a lot of people in this space, perhaps at this point, but I think that could change. The statutory authority from this comes also out of Title 18, it's Section 545, which basically has a really broadly worded statute that prohibits anyone who knowingly and willfully smuggles or clandestinely introduces or attempts to that any merchandise in the United States and or receives, conceals, buys, sells any of this that has been brought into the U.S. contrary to law. So that phrase, contrary to law, can be read very broadly, and that is how the courts, at least for the last 90, almost 100 years, have read it. There's a case from 1932 that says that the meaning of that contrary to any law is supposed to be read very broadly, and it includes a number of things, obviously counterfeiting activities, but also things like theft of IP. The one I think we'll see a lot of in the near term is any mislabeling, anything about the country of origin being changed, product labeling, product substitutions, transshipments, that kind of thing, where we're trying to get around these significant tariffs that only apply in certain times and for certain countries. It also could involve things as broad as any goods that were procured or created or manufactured in violation of labor laws. So it's a pretty broad statute. And not only does it apply maybe to the person or the company that imports or brings this in, it includes anyone who has knowledge of the legal violation if those entities or individuals buy, sell, receive, conceal, or even facilitate any of that. So what does that mean? That means that your whole entire supply chain has potential liability under 18 U.S.C. 545 or the statutes right adjacent to that. So a couple points on this I think will be interesting. The first is, like I said, the whole supply chain. Anyone sort of involved in this could be a potential defendant. The other, I think, important point is the knowledge of the violation of law. Recent-ish, in sort of the last 10, 15 years, case law has shown that to include willful blindness, which query how that lines up with a criminal statute that maybe requires mens rea. The courts have made clear negligence is not enough. It's not just you didn't know, but the idea is that you had deliberately avoided acquiring knowledge of the crime still can rise to be enough. So that deliberate avoidance, deliberate blindness could be enough for potential liability here. And the liability is significant. It's criminal statute, so it has fines, imprisonment up to 20 years. There's also civil penalties. And that's the other angle I think that's really interesting in this space is that the False Claims Act comes to center stage on this one. The False Claims Act obviously is going to prohibit any fraudulent overpayment or, by the government or fraudulent sort of retention of money that you might owe to the government. The False Claims Act is unique in some sense in that it allows for qui tam relators, so people who can nearly be a whistleblower and step in and bring the case, at least to the government on their behalf. And then the government can decide either to proceed with that, or sometimes even if they reject bringing the case themselves, the relator can still move forward with the case. So that already opens up another entire avenue of potential whistleblowers. A lot of people in this space thinking they could maybe get rich quick through a qui tam type action, and almost analogous to the whistleblower bounty type of thing. So I think we'll see this a lot, given that this is someone ostensibly defrauding the government if you're not paying the tariff rate that is now exorbitant. A lot of people may be looking around to see if they can catch people doing that. So I think the implications, at least for the compliance community, are huge. There's going to be a huge ramp up on country of origin, supply chain due diligence, all we've seen before, but also in the same vein as we've seen compliance as it relates to whistleblowers, ensuring that there's maybe some internal self-reporting on these topics, not simply like we've seen maybe in other issue-specific areas on potential bribes. Same here with any potential product mislabeling, country of origin mislabeling. I think this could, my prediction, this could be the next 5 years FCPA level work for compliance industry. That's my take. I'll take questions on it.
Karen Moore.
You're
on
muted.
mute.
Sorry. Interesting, because False Claims Act has really come to the fore. Just adding a comment here that the chances that third parties are going to pursue qui tam on the DEI front as well, because of the risk that if you do not halt your kind of DEI related activities and you're providing services to the U.S. government, you may be in violation of the False Claims Act. And just it opens up so much for interpretation. So I feel for any company that's doing government contracting.
All right. We are now on to our fan favorites, shout outs and rants. Mr. Armstrong, what do you have for us? And you're on mute.
I'm not sure if mine's it's certainly not a rant. It's a bit of a shout out, but it's a go get 'em girl to our friend Diana Trevley. Diana had a tragic horse riding accident in Argentina. She has come back in an air ambulance to Houston. I think she arrived back on the 29th. And so it's sending love, praise, thoughts to Diana and to Linda, her mum, and Melissa, her sister. And it is a shout out to the compliance community as well. Almost $70,000 has been raised from 416 people last time I looked to help get Diana back to the US. So well done to everybody who supported that. And as I say, love, thoughts, and prayers with Diana and her nearest and dearest.
Kelly.
I have one of each, a shout out and a rant. First, I want to give a shout out to Microsoft, which the other day picked up a new law firm, Jenner Block, which is one of the firms that is fighting the Donald Trump executive order against it. And what was interesting here is that Microsoft also dropped one of the firms, Simpson, Thacher, and Bartlett, that has cut a deal with the Trump administration. Now, nobody has expressly said that Microsoft is dropping Simpson, Bartlett, Simpson, Thacher because they are now in Trump orbit, and picked up Jenner Block because it is fighting what is clearly an illegal order and an unconstitutional attempt to constrain people's right to counsel. But it is nice to see that a large corporation is not afraid to pick up one of these firms that is fighting the Trump executive order, and at the expense of one of the firms that tried to cut a deal. Honestly, I think in the fullness of time, these half dozen firms or so that have cut deals with the Trump administration are going to rue the day they did that, because if you're a corporate client and you have issues with the Trump administration, you can no longer trust one of those firms that has cut a deal with the Trump administration that they're going to act in your best interests. They never should have done it. I praise Jenner Block and some of the others who are fighting it. And it's nice to see that Microsoft probably just didn't care. And for whatever reason, General Block was the best firm for its legal business that it had. They hired him. Great. Love to see it. The rant is against Republicans in Congress who moved this week to abolish the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board. That happened at the House Financial Services Committee. It is still a long way from being a done deal, but I do suspect when everything is said and done, the Republicans in Congress, yeah, they're going to do this probably, because I don't think there's a strong natural constituency to try and defend the PCAOB when there should be. It is not a good idea to abolish the audit industry's regulator and subsume those duties into the Securities and Exchange Commission, which is what Project 2025 and Republicans have been wanting to do pretty much since Republicans created the PCAOB 23 years ago with the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. This is not going to help the audit industry. It is going to make inspections take longer. It is going to make enforcement against errant audit firms less likely. It is not going to save companies really a dime. It's not going to save taxpayers a dime because taxpayers don't pay the budget for PCAOB or the SEC. This is not a cost-cutting thing for any taxpayer dollars. But really, the fundamental issue here is, are audit standards keeping pace with the fast-moving ways that business gets done and technology is happening? No, they're not. Will that happen and improve if audit is under the SEC? Absolutely not. It'll get even worse and even slower. And will this help smaller audit firms get back into the business of auditing public companies to try and keep audit fees down? I don't think that's going to happen either. The SEC is probably going to make oversight of the audit industry the redheaded stepchild of a very diminished agency anyways. This is just a bad idea. And so what did Republicans in Congress do? They poured gasoline on it this week. And it's going to be a shame if the PCAOB goes up in flames. There we go. That's it.
Karen Moore.
Yeah, I'm afraid I've got a rant as well. In Soviet Russia, especially in the Stalinist period, children were encouraged to report on their parents for anti-state activities. One Pavlik Morozov was hailed as a hero when he reported on his father, even though his father was later absolved from having engaged in any illegal activities. End of February, Department of Education in the United States launched a portal where students, children, and their parents can report on anti-DEI activities. They are limited to illegal discriminatory practices, but what is the world coming to where teachers now are in fear for their livelihood should a disgruntled child or their parent decide to report them for further investigation? Or whatever more conclusions you may.
On that cheery note, Karen Woody.
I'm going back to my pop culture references. This time I have another shout out because of the timeliness and some stroke of genius by whoever in Hollywood decided to release Conclave this year because it's a fantastic movie. It is obviously very timely. I felt almost bad because I saw it on the plane the night before the Pope died. So I thought, oh my gosh. I then decided maybe I should watch other documentaries. But I thought it was a fantastic show, very interesting, obviously a little probably sensationalized, maybe an interesting look into what's going on right now in the Vatican. So that was my shout out.
I'm going to have my first breaking news shout out because today San Antonio Spurs head coach Greg Popovich retired as a head coach. He has the most wins of any head coach in the National Basketball Association at 422. He has coached 2,291 games for the Spurs. That's the most of any one team head coach. He won 3 Coach of the Year awards, 2003, 2012, 2013. He has 5 NBA championships. He is generally recognized as one of the top 2 or 3 coaches of all times, and he's on the right side of history when it comes to social justice. Tip of the hat to Greg Popovich. He had a serious stroke in the fall and has not been able to return to coaching. He had a great run. Coach Pop. So, ladies and gentlemen, great episode, a lot of fun. I can't wait till we get back together again.
Thank you, Tom.
Compliance Podcast Network. Start your mornings with daily compliance news, quick, sharp updates on the top compliance and ethics stories in under 5 minutes every morning in Compliance Podcast Network. Because compliance never sleeps. Need practical advice fast? Check out Compliance Tip of the Day, one actionable idea to level up your program. Short and sweet, every day on Compliance Podcast Network. Got 10 minutes? We've got the week's top 10 stories. 10 for 10 brings you the big compliance headlines. Fast, fun, and focused. Every Saturday on Compliance Podcast Network. And don't miss the Sunday Book Review, where compliance meets culture through must-read books and big ideas every Sunday in Compliance Podcast Network. Whether you're in the office, on a walk, or commuting, stay smart, stay ethical, stay tuned. Only on the Compliance Podcast Network, available wherever you listen to podcasts.